This week's episode of the Rural Woman Podcast is brought to you by the patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast. This amazing group of individuals contribute financially to the Rural Woman Podcast to ensure the stories of women in agriculture hit your earbuds each and every week. Want to join them in supporting the stories of women in agriculture while getting access to extended episodes, patron-only episodes, and other great perks? Head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more about how you can become a patron through Patreon. Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Rural Woman Podcast. Today you'll meet Courtney Witt. Courtney is a wife, mom of 3, plant nursery owner, and a flower farmer. Courtney and her husband, Andrew, moved to a small town in rural Arkansas shortly after getting married 10 years ago to follow their farming dreams. Andrew and Courtney found themselves holding regular off-farm jobs while hobby farming. They knew God had more in store for them and took a leap of faith when they sold their beloved farm and bought a 40-plus-year-old plant nursery. They converted the old barn into their shop and home and turned the unused land into a U-cut flower farm. While they will always have their farm animals, Floriculture has opened up a new world of farming for them, flower farming. Before we get to Courtney's episode today, I would like to invite you to join us over on our Facebook group. I haven't talked about our Facebook community for a long time. The Rural Woman Podcast community has grown over on Facebook, and we have some great things happening there. For instance, we have our weekly discussion questions. We also have a series called Gab with the Guests, where we encourage you to ask your own follow-up questions to the guests that you hear on the Rural Woman Podcast. And once in a while, I let my friend Kim from Kim & Co. post her cheesy farm jokes that will surely make any farmer, rancher, rural woman go, ha ha. So head on over to the show notes and you can find the link to the Rural Woman Podcast community over on Facebook. And we would love to welcome you in there. Without further ado, my friends, let's get to this week's episode with Courtney. Courtney, welcome to the Rural Woman Podcast. How are you today?
I'm so good and excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Such an honor.
I am so excited to get to dive into your story and to learn all about Blossomberry Nursery and how you got started. But let's go back to way before that. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and how you got your start here.
Okay. My name's Courtney Witt. I was born and raised in Southern California, so not too far from the beach, not too far from Disneyland, kind of that area. And my husband and I started dating around 21, 22, 23, somewhere in there. We grew up in the same city. We lived in like what we call tract homes, so every third house is like the same model. They're pretty close together. And I was dog sitting for these ladies, and they had backyard chickens. And so I told my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, I'm like, hey, you got to come with me to take care of these dogs and chickens. This is so neat. And I would say, this was almost about 10 years ago. Backyard chickens then wasn't a huge thing in our area. They were literally the only people that I knew. And then come to find out later, my now father-in-law's next door neighbor had backyard chickens as well, but it wasn't like everybody has them like they do now. So I said, aren't these so cool? And we just were like, they're so like weird, almost like prehistoric looking creatures. And they lay eggs, and how fun is this? I mean, just, I guess, your typical city kid kind of reaction to that. And so we convinced his dad to let us build a chicken coop in his backyard. And we collected all these pallets from local grocery stores, built this chicken coop. 4 suddenly turned into 10, which I'm not sure we were allowed to have that many. And all of the neighbors around it would, watch over the fence, or we'd give them eggs. And the neighbors next door that had backyard chickens themselves, they were actually missionary pilots in Africa, and they had just returned, from my knowledge. And they said to my husband, or boyfriend at the time, now husband, you love this. This is your hobby. Like, you two get off work and this is what you do. You're so good at this. You're a natural. At this point, we had gotten a little like miniature pig in his backyard too. I mean, it was turning into a farm. And he said, you need to go to school for livestock production and management. And my husband is like, I don't, like, they offer that around here? Where? So we went to this local community college up the road, and we're like, let's just go in and just kind of see what it's like. And out walks this guy in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, and he had an accent, and we're like, who is this guy? So we sat down and talked to him, and Andrew was like, look, I'm not really interested in the degree. As soon as Courtney finishes school to become a special ed teacher, we want to move to Texas and start a farm. He said, I really just want to learn what I need to learn to be able to do that. And this guy, that's how he grew up, in Arkansas, of all places. And so he really took my husband under his wing, was still to this day is a mentor to him in his life, which is so valuable and important, and just taught him how to build fence, just animal husbandry, all the stuff. And my husband soaked it all in. He started working at the school's little farm, once he finished his classes, and I would get to go with him at nights or on the weekends to help feed. And I just realized it was a slower pace of life, and it just we could not wait to get out of Southern California and start our own farm. So he's like, look, you don't want to move to Texas. You want to go to Arkansas. We're like, Arkansas? Why Arkansas? We had never been there. I guess what you picture it isn't really what it's like at all. So he's like, if you go to these museums, I'll give you some extra credit. Just go over spring break. And the minute we drove in, we were like, this place is beautiful. It's so green. There's trees everywhere. Beautiful farmland. Everyone is so nice. It was affordable. Not everybody was moving there. And so we were like, yeah, this is it. And so we got engaged. I finished college to become a special ed teacher and got married on 4th of July. And at the end of the month, moved to Arkansas.
I love that story, Courtney. Just the slow journey into it and having it as kind of an interest, and then it turns into a hobby. And then it sounds like it turned into the all-out plan that you were going to make this happen, whether it was in Texas or in Arkansas. I'm always curious to ask, as a fellow city kid who grew up in town, what are some of your first memories around food and food production? I know in California there's so many different crops grown, but what are your first memories around food and where food came from?
I was never a huge vegetable fan as a kid. I remember one time my mom steamed broccoli, and I almost gagged, and she thought I was being dramatic. And I was like, no, I'm serious. I just can't eat this. It was like really soggy and watery. And when I was 18, my aunt took me to Ireland to visit family friends. And she grew a little garden in her backyard. And she had made, salad and vegetables on the side, all from her garden. And I loved it all. I thought it was delicious. I couldn't get enough. And that was kind of when I realized there is a difference. Obviously, how you cook it helps too, but I think that kind of sparked something in me young, and I just started to kind of appreciate gardening. I lived at home, and we had an in-ground pool in our backyard and a barbecue, and there really wasn't any room to garden. But I just remember being so fascinated by hers, and I just noticed such a difference in the taste of the food that she grew herself.
I think I would much rather have the in-ground pool in my backyard in California versus maybe a garden. But that's just coming from somebody who doesn't have an in-ground pool.
Yeah, it's, Southern California, it gets a little cold. Or not, the weather doesn't, but the pools do. So, but we leave them open all year, and you can kind of heat them. And it was awesome. When I went to Ireland and I ate these fresh vegetables grown out of her garden, I was just amazed. And all of a sudden I liked vegetables more than I ever had in my entire life. So
that's awesome. So take us back to 2017. You and Andrew are married and you pack up the car and you're heading to Arkansas. How was it for you as a young couple to try and find land in a completely different state? And what were you looking for specifically as new farmers?
It was slow growing. We actually moved in 2015 and we rented for 2 years. And I was a special ed teacher. He worked for the highway department. And so that was honestly kind of hard because you just have this dream of buying land and starting a farm, and that becomes your job. And it's so much easier said than done and harder than it seems. And so we were like, here we are, like doing 2 normal jobs we could have been doing in California. And our dream just seemed so far off. So finally in 2017, we bought a fixer-upper, which we weren't, the fixer-upper, I guess, when you're young and buying your first house, that doesn't really scare you. It was more so the land and the potential. So it was really just how much acreage could we get and how much of it would be usable for farmland or pasture, really. Our original goal when we moved out here was to have like a start to finish operation. So raise them up and then be able to sell our own beef. My husband, cows are his all-time favorite. They've really grown on me as well. They're so, I don't know, just cute and gentle, and there's so much more to them than you would think. So yeah, we bought a little 10-acre farm with a fixer-upper for the first 4 years. Every extra penny we had just went to fencing and animals, and we built a pond or dug a pond, all this stuff. Just really, we poured all of our time, energy, and money into the outside. And then once our farm was kind of up and going where we needed it after 4 years, we started focusing more so on the inside because, like I said, it was kind of a fixer-upper. And we really thought that it would be our forever home and just hoped that in the future we would be able to buy more land. But I just knew that if God brought us all the way out here away from everybody that we knew, and I knew that this, outdoor farming kind of lifestyle was in the cards somehow, it just was like our farm was kind of like a hobby farm. We still had our off-farm jobs of teaching in the highway department. And my husband, he actually ended up quitting the highway department and he got hired on our neighbor and dear friend's cattle ranch, which was really awesome. He loved that. And that allowed me to stay home for 6 months until we bought Blossomberry. But it just felt like our dreams and our farm kind of outgrew that 10 acres pretty quick.
Right. Well, and like you said, it was a big move and a big dream that you had to be a farmer and to be a part of agriculture. And like you said, working your off-farm jobs to raise home and work more. I always kind of laugh when people call themselves a hobby farmer, because I think like a hobby should almost be relaxing and, it should do things, which, in some cases farming can be relaxing. I say that with like the quotation marks around it. Being outside and being in nature and like working in the soil and everything. That's, that to me sounds relaxing, but at the end of the day, it's actually a lot of hard work. So I always kind of chuckle when people say, I have a hobby farm. I'm like, you probably need a new hobby if that's what you think hobbying is.
Right. Yeah. We never got to the whole start to finish operation, but we did just have, mama cows, and we'd breed them and sell the calves. So, I mean, we did, make money, but we still had to have our off-farm jobs. And I always joke with people, I'm like, you don't have backyard chickens to save money on eggs. You have backyard chickens because you want better quality eggs or you love chickens, but there's really nothing cheap about farming. And especially if you want to do it right. And I think, a lot of people have a little bit of a leg up because they do have some family land. And it does not mean they don't work just as hard as everybody else, because we all know whether you have some land that's available to you or you have to buy your own, everybody has to work just as hard. But I do think, having some family land at your disposal is a little bit of a leg up.
For sure. Yeah. And the generational aspect of farming, whatever way you look at it, farming is a lot of work and it's hard. Whether you are just starting out and you are starting from scratch, whether you have that land and it comes with the generational pressure of keeping that legacy alive. Doesn't matter how you shake the stick, it's still a lot of work.
Yeah, exactly. It's not an easy feat, but it's super rewarding, and it's just, a total lifestyle.
Absolutely. You can help support the stories of women in agriculture to be shared through the Rural Woman podcast on Patreon. What is Patreon? It's a membership-based platform that helps fund and support creators like me to create and produce content like this that you all love. New to the Rural Woman podcast Patreon is ad-free listening and patron-only bonus content and exclusive episodes. Learn more and join the patron gang today at patreon.com/The Rural Woman Podcast. So tell us how you kind of shifted gears and when did the nursery come into vision for you, and what made you pursue this other opportunity?
So, like I said, I was a special ed teacher, which I loved. I just had 2 little kids at home and one on the way, and I wanted nothing more than to just be home with them all day, because I'm like, they're only little once. I'm pouring everything I have into these other kids that I love dearly, but I feel like my kids are so little and I'm never going to get this back and they need me. So I was driving home from work one day, pregnant with my third, and I was thinking, what can I do that would allow me more time with my kids or even more time together as a family? And I thought, you know what? I have always loved Blossomberry. And so to me, it was just a magical place. And I thought, what a neat place this is. Every time I pulled up, I'd buy a lot of vegetable starts there because we've always grown a big garden. And so I just called the owner one day on my way home from work and said, would you consider selling your business? And she kind of laughed because I caught her so off guard. And she said, no, and even if I would, I wouldn't sell the land. And I was thinking, well, that would be a lot of work to move a nursery. So I just said, okay, thanks, bye. I didn't tell my husband about it. I thought it wasn't going anywhere. 2 weeks later, she called back and she's like, hey, actually, we would consider selling. And I'm like, how'd you know it was me? I purposely didn't leave my name. She's like, well, I do have caller ID. I'm like, oh, yeah, it is, 2022 or whatever year it was. So then I had to tell my husband about this idea. So we went and looked at it, but he had just accepted a job offer working for that cattle ranch, who are good friends of ours and our old neighbors. And that was going to allow me to stay home for, with my 3 kids, which was all I really ever wanted. And so we came and looked at it. We're like, yeah, it's just not the right timing for our family. I have to finish out the school year. Our son's due in June. Andrew just accepted this new job. So then they reached out a couple weeks later. Hey, just want to give you one last opportunity before we go ahead and list it with a realtor. And we said, yeah, it's just not the right timing. So they went ahead and listed it with a realtor. There was this little twinge, and I'm like, oh, that hurts a little. But I just told myself, I'm about to be living my best life as a stay-at-home mom on our little farm, and it's going to go to whoever it's meant to go to. And so I just kept praying that if it was God's will for us, he would put it on my husband's heart. And I never brought it up again because I'm like, I'm going to soak up every second I have being a stay-at-home farm mom with my kids. And then my husband came to me probably that fall, and he's like, do you think that we made the right decision with Blossomberry? And I said, I have no clue. I said, I could, just see if it's still available. And so, nobody had put an offer on it. So why don't we just pursue it? And if it's not meant to be, something's not going to work out. And so that's what we did. We pursued it, and I just kept praying that if it's your will for us, let this work out. If not, we don't want it. And sometimes that can be a hard prayer to pray. But I realized that, I really don't want it if it's not God's will because, self-explanatory there. But his timing and his plans are always better and greater than ours. And so almost a year later, we sold our house. And 2 days later, we closed on Blossomberry Nursery.
That is an incredible story, Courtney. The fact that you were driving home and just thought, hey, I'm going to phone and see if they would sell their business to me. That is absolutely, to me, it's crazy, but in the best of ways.
Yes. One of our favorite movies is that movie, We Bought a Zoo. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Yeah, and in that he talks about when he first sees his wife for the first time at this restaurant, and he approaches her and he's like, all it took was 30 seconds of courage. And I remember telling myself that before I made the phone call.
Absolutely. That made me a little bit misty, Courtney, the 30 seconds of courage that it took. And obviously, you didn't buy it the next day. You didn't convince your husband that it would be a good purchase to make. And eventually it all worked out that you did. And you sold your house and your land. So tell us about that transition from going from your 10-acre farm and going to the nursery.
It was so hard. We weren't really sure how we were going to make it all come into play. And so I was like, I'll just call the realtor out and see what they think. And in hindsight, there was no way we could have made this work without doing that. We couldn't have kept up with both. And so they came out and looked at it, and they're like, actually, we have an all-cash buyer, and this is exactly what they're looking for. Do you care if I send them some pictures? And I'm like, no, you can send them some pictures. And then they're like, they want to see it. I'm like, well, can you just give us a week? There's just a few things I want to wrap up, And so Christmas night, my husband was doing the last thing on the list, which was replacing an exhaust fan in our bathroom. And he fell through the ceiling, hit like a pony wall on the way down, and then landed on our tile floor. He ended up getting out of the ER at 3 a.m., the 26th, and they were coming to look at our house at 8 a.m., so we pushed it back to 10. They come to look at our house, and they're like, when can we close?
Oh my gosh.
And so he moved our entire house with cracked ribs in 2 weeks. And my in-laws were kind enough to let us stay like in their like vacation home out here. So we moved everything into, their like vacation home out here. They still live in California and just come and visit once in a while, which was such a huge gift and a blessing to us. So we move everything into their house. My husband has cracked ribs, which takes like weeks to heal. And then he starts getting like really sick. And we finally find out he has alpha-gal, which means you get it from a tick bite and you're like allergic to red meat. But it's like really hard to figure out because the allergic reaction happens like hours after you eat it, not right away. So the poor guy, we bought this total fixer-upper of a nursery. We're starting to convert, this old barn on the property into our house. The learning curve of how to run a plant nursery was, like Mount Everest. We grew a big garden, but, selling trees and shrubs, it was a year of learning. And so, he's all better now, thank goodness. But that was the start of our first year in business. And then, learning how to be business owners when you've always worked for other people. And yeah, it was wild.
That is a busy first year for so many different reasons. Well, and like you said, just learning to be a business owner when you've worked for others for so long. There's so many things as entrepreneurs that we kind of forget about when it comes down to it of, oh, this is my responsibility and it's nobody else's responsibility until I delegate that responsibility to somebody else.
Yes. I joke all the time. I'm like, well, right now I'm like the marketing director. In an hour, I'm going to be like our accountant. And tomorrow I'm just going to be like the CEO, like you wear all the hats.
So take me through, it's been a couple years now that you've had the nursery. What was your typical growing year, or do you know what your typical growing year is? And how do you run a nursery, Courtney? This is the biggest question.
Yeah, and I promise this all has to do with farming, but January 11th was a year since we bought Blossomberry. So we finished up our first year. It felt like we were a little bit behind with, every step of the way. You start your cold crops this time and your spring vegetables this time, and you bring in your shrubs this time, and your bare root fruit trees and berries you plant in February, so you got to have those in then. And you start bringing in your annuals this time and mums this time. And it's not even necessarily when you bring them into, it's also when you order them. Because if you don't order them by the right date, then everything's sold out. So thankfully the previous owners left us like a good schedule, and I could text them and ask them questions. And then we have a really good relationship with the original owners who owned it for almost 40 years. And he is like a walking encyclopedia. Really well known in the horticulture world, breeds crepe myrtles. And so thankfully he lets me call him and pick his brain whenever I need to as well. But yeah, it just feels some days like you're kind of juggling all these different balls, But there's 20 acres here. It's over 40 years old. Blossomberry Nursery has been around for over 40 years old. It's this, in my mind, magical plant nursery at the foothills of the Ozarks. And it's like, this really historical place in our community. And so many people come up here and they have the best memories with their grandmothers, with their moms, with their grandpas as kids. And they're like, I used to love to come here as kids. And it just needed some cleaning up. And so we've had a really good community support as far as understanding that, hey, this is our first year. We've never done this before. And just them being so happy and excited to see it being cleaned up. But I think what some people didn't realize, and now everybody's, seeing this, was that we didn't buy it for it to just be a plant nursery. I mean, there's 20 acres here, and so there's like all this unused space, and we were like, at our last house, we loved having people over for breakfast on the weekends or dinner and walking around our garden and being like, this out, or look at how these Brussels sprouts grow, or check out this dahlia that just opened. And we loved gardening. It was so rewarding, and then being able to share it with everyone. And so I feel like the two words that come to mind when I think about our goals for Blossomberry is community and hospitality. And like I said, we had, grew a big garden. We were getting into cut flowers and dreamed of having like a U-pick. But at our last house, it was like, where would people park? And how do we make this happen here? But once we bought Blossomberry, it was like, hey, we can make this happen. And so our dream of start to finish, cattle operation switched to flower farming. And so our first year, because we were trying to figure out how to run a plant nursery, we got started a little later than usual. But our flower farm will probably this year be open from like in April or May and go until our last frost, which, last year was the day before Halloween. Sometimes we get lucky and it's early November. So instead of, farming like we had planned when we first moved out here, we're flower farming and stepping into the floriculture world. And it has been so wonderful. I mean, just the reactions that you get from people when they see flowers. We had a lady that came that was a refugee from Ukraine, and she was having like a big procedure done the next day, but she teared up when she was out there. A college student that came from, I want to say, El Salvador, and she teared up when she was out there. We had this guy come up here. He cut the most beautiful bouquet, and he said, I used to come here with my grandma. I just remember having like wagons full of flats of flowers, and her birthday is today, and I'm going to bring this to her.
That is so sweet.
And it feels like our way of being like, thank you so much for welcoming us to your beautiful state, your lovely community with open arms. And this is our way of contributing to that and saying thank you.
For sure. Well, and you started the story off by talking about the original owners of Blossomberry, and for you to be able to have that mentorship piece, I think is so important. And, for you to be able to continue that legacy with your family and welcoming your community to continue to have those memories is just so special.
Yeah, it's been really, really hard, but just as awesome and rewarding as it has been hard.
Absolutely.
Which I think is normal, when anything you do for the first time, and obviously, starting your own business as well.
Right. Well, and you think of the term like my first rodeo, it's like, well, how many rodeos do you need to have until it's not hard anymore? And why do we have to be so good at our first one? We don't have to. Like, we're here to learn and you're here to grow, pun intended. But, you're there for a reason, and you're new business owners. And it sounds like your community has welcomed you with open arms and are obviously looking forward to your next growing season. So, Courtney, what are some of your plans? What are some of your grand plans for Blossomberry Nursery in welcoming your community?
Definitely just continue to grow the flower farm this year. I think we're almost going to double the amount of flowers we had last year, if not more. And then we need to get some fence built and hopefully get our cows over here. And I don't know exactly, I think we'll always have cows and chickens, and my daughter really wants goats. And I don't know exactly how that's all going to play out in the future and what, our new plan or goals will be, but our middle son, I mean, cows are his world. He eats, sleeps, and breathes cows. And when we went and picked up some of our fencing material from my father-in-law's house yesterday, his eyes lit up and he's like, "Are we getting our cows back?" And thankfully we have good friends that are holding them at their farm right now. But yeah, we're definitely, my husband and I both love the flower farm. We love growing them. We love arranging them. But also we love welcoming people to come and experience them themselves and cut their own bouquets. And so definitely that. And I'm not sure exactly how, the cows and chickens and all of that will come to play. But I am excited to see it all unfold in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And for your daughter, I also love goats and I love flowers. All I can say is make sure you have really good fencing and you should be fine.
Oh, no.
There have been many a times I've looked out my front window and on my front step, my goats, Kitty and Babs, are munching on my flower pots.
Oh, no. Maybe we'll have to keep them on a total opposite side of the property.
That is my expert opinion on all of that. So
that is good to know.
Yes. Courtney, it has been an absolute pleasure to hear your story today. My last question for you is, what is the most rewarding part about being a rural woman for you?
The lifestyle and raising my kids this way. I think when you live rural, it really puts your priorities into perspective, and it teaches you to be so content and just to slow down. And I really feel like by moving from Southern California to Arkansas, I really slowed down. I didn't realize that I didn't have to be running 1,000,000 miles an hour all the time and have this huge social life. And so that's really how we try to raise our kids now. And I feel like the rural lifestyle just really helps you to live a slow-paced, simple life.
For sure. And it's, you respect and you enjoy the slowness of it and being outside and being with your family. And, what a great community that you have around you, and something that I look forward to watching you grow and the nursery to grow. So again, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. For those who would like to connect with you online, where can they find you?
I have Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and they're all Blossomberry Nursery.
And for those listening, I highly recommend that you go look at some of the before and after pictures of Blossomberry Nursery. Courtney and Andrew have done a lot of work, and their refurbished barn house is adorable.
Oh, thank you so much. And I appreciate you so much for having me on here. It was so nice to get to talk to you, and just always enjoy talking with like-minded people. So
thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer, and admin support from Kim & Co. Online. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story. Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon.